Welcome to Psych Health and Safety in Canada podcast. I'm your host, Marianne Baton, and today I'm really happy to welcome Myla Bulych. Myla is a coach and a consultant, and she's got some things to share with us. Myla, let's start with how you ever learned about psych health and safety to begin with.
Sure. So it really comes out of, my passion for personal mental health and my own lived experience. Ultimately, it was from, I sit on the board of directors for the Canadian Mental Health Association Saskatchewan division, and I first learned about it there. But what led me to that room and to that board of directors table was really my own lived experience with mental health and a very pivotal conversation I had with my boss about my mental health in the workplace. And ultimately, it's led me to where I am today, that really defining conversation. And I guess I could dig in a little bit more about that if you'd like to hear more.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about the conversation because so many of our listeners are trying to respond and be supportive to people who are, and right now so many of us are struggling with mental health due to the world, the pandemic. So help us understand what that conversation was and how it impacted you.
It was 2012, so 10 years ago now, and on Facebook, I was living the life as many of us perceive others to be. I traveled a lot, had a great social life, dinners out. I was a mid-level executive, and I posted it all on Facebook, but really behind the scenes, I was so depressed that I couldn't focus. I was having memory issues. In between those fabulous outings, I was completely isolating myself. And even though I lived alone, I was spending a lot of the time in my bedroom and ordering takeout. And I just felt like I had a veil of fog over me, and it was really sad. And it was really starting to show up in my work, or so at least I thought it was. I was a high performer, and I just couldn't seem to find my way through the information. And I had just taken a couple weeks off, and I with a handful of girlfriends, and we went golfing and wine touring in BC. And it was fabulous holiday. Again, the pictures would tell you I had a wonderful time, but I also found myself having to tap out quite a bit and spend alone time. And even though these friends were very, very supportive, they noticed, right? One friend said, it was at moments it was like you didn't want to be there. And that really stuck with me. And I didn't know what I did per se, but it stuck with me. So fast forward to a little bit after that, I had asked my boss through email for a little bit more time off. And, I was just coming off the heels of this trip. I had just been to Ireland as well on a solo trip. And I just said, I'm having a hard time finding my footing here, and I just need a little bit more time off. And she didn't respond through email, but instead she came into my office and she closed the door and she sat down, and oh my God, my heart was in my throat, and I knew I was in trouble for something because my performance had been declining. I'm asking for this time off. And she looked me in the eyes, and as soon as she started talking, that lump in my throat just almost cut off my breath. And I'm like, here it comes. I'm going to get it. But instead, she softened. Her whole energy softened, or at least I finally noticed it, and her eyes softened. And she compassionately said to me, "Is everything okay?" And every constrained emotion I had for the past few years just all came out in that moment. I was separating from my then husband. I had a new living situation. I was afraid about finances, fears of being alone, things like that. It all bubbled up and I just started bawling. And I said, no, it's not okay. And so we talked for a really long time. And at this point, I'd only been there working alongside her for about a year and a half. And I don't remember exactly the contents of our conversation, but obviously it was whatever I felt like sharing with her, because in that moment, I instantly trusted her because she came in with this caring, compassionate openness to whatever was happening. And I told her a lot. And I just remember feeling like I was being held by another human, figuratively speaking, for the first time in a really long time. And it gave me back some dignity that I still didn't necessarily feel like I deserved, but she made me feel like I was important and that whatever my needs were, she was open to. So she said to me, well, what do you need? And I said to her, I need a little bit more time off. And she said, I don't know, Myla, if that's really what you do need. And I thought, oh God, I have to sell myself and maybe I don't need it. But instead she said, I think you're selling your needs a little short. And I think you need more than what you're asking for to reset. And what about, some modified time off for long-term instead of these little breaks here and there? And the relief, let me tell you, the relief. I had undersold myself and I needed her to tell me that I was worthy of more. And I swear it felt like I took the first breath of my life in about 4 years at the end of that conversation. And I still felt quite ashamed and that I had been outed per se, because obviously she picked up on some stuff to be in my office, but I sincerely felt that she was there to support whatever I needed. And gosh, when I look back now, that was over 10 years ago. And that was a blip on the radar now, 10 years ago, but it was a seminal moment. And I was able to get back on my feet and do great things in that organization. And it really showed me that true compassion and caring and can really make the difference between, life and death, in my case, in that job, but probably beyond that. And it was really humbling, and it just catapulted me to want to learn more and support anybody else who is struggling. And so as hard as it was, I also look at it as a gift, and I'm on the other side of it, and I learned a lot from it. And I'm by no means 100% every day, but I have that experience, like I said, that was absolutely pivotal in my life. And one of the other interesting things was we're in a small office. So we didn't have an HR team. There was 4 of us. We had no policies. There was no talk of psychological health and safety at that time. But yet I had a leader that really picked up on what was happening. And it felt like she wasn't afraid to sit in the uncomfortableness of whatever she was about to hear. And because of that, we didn't have the policies, but we had the culture, the unwritten culture of psychological health and safety. And I feel that's why I ended up thriving in that organization for so long.
So many things are running through my head, Myla, with the story that you shared, is that what you're really saying is that a boss just saying, how are you? And holding space was all you really needed. I mean, she didn't fix it. She didn't tell you what to do. She didn't try to analyze you or get you treatment. She just held space to listen to you with compassion.
Simple, isn't it? But honestly, that's truly what it was. And it was a life changer for me. And it like I said, it really, it's lived with me so deeply and for so long that I can talk about it today like it happened yesterday. And I feel it today like it happened yesterday. And so, there's the sayings that use your words wisely because you don't know how impactful they are. And in that case, on such a positive note and such an unjudging perspective, and just like you said, making space for me and whatever needed to be said was absolutely life-changing. And this boss is, former boss now, still a friend, a mentor. Man, I look up to her, and she had no formal training, but it was just inherently there. So I feel like for those of us where it's not inherently there, there's an ability to build that, though. I think you just need the desire to bring that forward. And it's like any muscle, you train for a marathon, you don't do it overnight. When you're talking to people about psychological health and safety, you got to train and build that muscle as well.
Another part of your story, Myla, that's really striking me is, and I've heard it many times, the relief. You said it was like you breathed for the first time in 4 years because you took all these thoughts that were in your mind, all these things you're experiencing, and you were able to verbalize them. Can you help people to understand why you didn't do that for the 4 years prior? Because I think sometimes we feel like, well, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say that? But it's not quite that easy.
Yeah, I guess it all comes down to shame and stigma. And I still feel it to this day, even though I'm a mental health advocate and I try to break free of the stigma and speak my truth. But at the time, I personally felt like I should have been able to figure this out, and that I maybe didn't deserve an, in quotes, easy out. Yet I needed it so badly, but I also just, my thinking was so distorted at the time that I actually needed somebody to hold my hand and help me through it and reassure me that it's okay to need some time off, and that people are willing to help you. There's probably some belief systems in there that I didn't deserve it. And like I said, that I should have been able to figure it out on my own. And I still think that some days, right? I think our, mental health is a spectrum. It's not static, it moves. And we're, good some days, not so good other days. We're more in line with what we want our belief systems to be one day, and the next day we kind of fall backwards. So just having, like, I think I felt her energy in that moment, and it felt safe. And that's exactly what, psychological health and safety is. I didn't have the words at the time, but I knew what it felt like. I knew how she made me feel. And it felt like I could be vulnerable in that moment. Yeah. And I think, for a lot of people who also don't have the words, they can feel it, and, you have that colleague or that boss where you're just not so sure. And, there's probably, it's a bit tricky. There's probably some truth to it, but also there's, those distorted thoughts in our head. So, I don't know. We just had this magical moment that was ever life-changing, and it was a trust between two people that is invaluable for the rest of my life.
Yeah. But yet you have friends that had a similar experience, but their experience at work was completely different. Do you want to share a bit about that?
Yeah, one of my good friends, very, very similar beginnings to the story, in that they were experiencing depression, foggy, their work performance started to decline, isolating themselves, etc. But, plugging away at work. And arguably, out of the blue, was called in for a meeting after just a couple days after a performance review, where the performance review showed that there was no challenges, but yet a few days later was brought in with HR and a boss, and was told that their performance was lacking, they seemed unfocused, and they were being watched and kind of had a first strike against them. And ultimately, this person at the same time was going through a significant mental break, and they were recently got put under the care of a psychiatrist. And having known my story, me and this person chatted, and I encouraged them to, get in touch with their union rep, and I helped them along the way to navigate this. And it was not a fantastic outcome, but they did have policies in place. They worked for a large organization, hundreds of people, large HR division, policies on mental health and wellness in their corporation, but yet it just didn't translate to that person's lived experience. So even though they had been declining, and obviously management had saw it to some degree, they didn't address it head on. Instead, they took it to HR, and ultimately, the person, because they were under the care of a psychiatrist, thankfully, was able to get a sick note, and they got some time off, and they transitioned back to work. Now, the transition back, to my understanding, was not a great one. And the stigma just followed them. And their perspective was that their manager just really didn't change their perspective on their capacity, even though they felt better. And years ago, when they were working at their ultimate best, they had a lot more responsibilities and felt more engaged in their work. But they were, given nominal assignments and were passed over for promotions. And they firmly believed that the stigma within their area there, because of their mental break, still existed. And just, again, we talk about culture. This large corporation had all the policies, but their leaders and whatever culture was there just didn't support it being fulsomely developed or delivered to this individual who really needed it. So we had very similar beginnings, but the outcomes were significantly different. And ultimately, this person ended up leaving that job. And I'm happy to say they're at another job and exceeding their employer's expectations. They
your boss got a loyal, hardworking employee coming back, thankful and grateful for what they did for them, and his ended up with somebody who walked away and probably doesn't have a lot of positive things to say about the organization.
Exactly. Yeah. And it wasn't that this person didn't have the capacity. They had a tough time, and they came back, and the back to work stigma just existed, and they couldn't get out of that rut.
Right.
And it's really unfortunate well, for that organization, but I'm happy to say that this person is doing so much better in saying that the culture where they're at now is so much different, and they feel valued, and they're happy to do all the work that's asked for them, and they're really thriving. And it's just incredible how the people around you really define your work experience. It's not even necessarily the work, it's the people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I'm thinking about the leaders that have said to me, oh yeah, as soon as I brought up performance, then suddenly they had a mental health issue. And I said, or do you think they had a mental health issue and therefore they have performance issues? But that's the misunderstanding that some people have about the situation. Now, Myla, you took all of the things that you've been through and you turned it around to learn how to help others, to help organizations. Can you talk a bit about the kind of things that you do now?
Yeah, so after that situation, I really dove into my own self-awareness training, for lack of a better term. And I took lots of courses on human behavior, and ultimately I got my coach certification and my master's as an integral coach. And so I do have a coaching business. But when I got to the board of directors of the Canadian Mental Health Association, as I mentioned, for the first time I learned about the psychological health and safety certification, and I took that training because of, it just felt like a no-brainer to me that, wow, this is putting on paper all of the things that I experienced and maybe didn't experience, and putting some steps and pragmatism to it. And so, of course, sign me up, and I took it. It was wonderful. And really the biggest takeaway that I got from that training was it doesn't have to be a monumental exercise to start putting some psychological health and safety policies in place in your organization. It's really, again, about the intent and building that desire and starting to create that culture of a safe environment. And it just really needs to start with a conversation and asking the staff what they need to feel safe and psychologically well in the workplace. And it can be actually quite simple. And so I, can work with clients and guide. And my bit of a focus is really on leadership development. And because, like I said, in my case, my leader, I could arguably say, felt comfortable in that, or maybe more comfortable might be a better term, to sit with a difficult conversation that she knew was probably coming. Whereas my friend's leader, we might be able to deduce that they did not feel comfortable, and therefore they didn't explore, and they felt so uncomfortable that it almost became catastrophic. So my desire is really to work with leaders and coach them on how to address challenges of working with staff and the difficult conversations and the difficult emotions that might come up with them, and build that muscle. Like I said, like training for a marathon, build it. It's not going to be there overnight, and just let them tap into their own belief systems and neurology and see what's in there, become self-aware, and ultimately be open to hold space for their staff that might be experiencing some challenging times. Oh, I'm not hearing you at the moment.
Oh,
there you are. I can hear you now.
Thanks, Myla. I'm thinking about some of the leaders that I've worked with over the years who say, look, I can't deal with my own emotions. I don't deal with the emotions of my family, but you're asking me to do it at work. And that path to self-awareness, although we're asking them to do it, because their job is to support employees, ends up with such unintended consequences in terms of benefits for their own well-being and for the way that they are in the world with their family and friends. Can you talk a little bit about how you would suggest to a leader who is this maybe concrete linear thinker that has not ever developed their emotional intelligence? Where do they start?
Again, it's ask them, it's, when it comes to coaching, and just like that simple question of what do you think you need, and just go from there. They need to know that if they do work with a coach, it's really about us holding space for them. And many of them have not had that, because as a leader, it does get lonely at the top. And like you said, they are already holding space consciously and unconsciously, doing it well or doing it not very well for so many others. This is an opportunity for us to hold the space as coaches for them, and just for them to ease into even the idea, and ease into the concept of what they're even feeling about the idea, rather than really digging in, especially if it's a new concept to them or it feels a bit foreign. Really, the idea is to meet them where they are and explore and be curious together, and look at it almost as a third person. And, oh, isn't that interesting? And what do you feel about that? Or what do you think about that? And where do you think that way of that belief system came from? So they can really explore themselves and be curious. And it does not need to be monumental, but the ripple effect of the desire to want to do better is really the most important thing. So when we talk about coaching, yes, unintended effects and intended, like if we're going to talk about holding space for your staff, it really comes about you filling your own cup first so that you can hold space for others and do it better. And it's absolutely about giving the client what they need at that moment, no more, no less, and they get to define it. We just get to be there to help them draw out what they already know.
Yeah. I've used coaching many times when I've felt stuck, and it's usually one session and they say, well, what about? And it's like, like, it's just so simple, right? As you're saying, it's so simple, but it's just sometimes in the busyness of trying to lead, we can't do it. But I want to pick up on holding space. It's a very new agey term that a lot of people don't get. And I think when we learn to do it, it becomes very simple. But it's really about being with somebody without having an agenda, without thinking about what you're going to say to them, without being stressed, without being distracted. How would you describe holding space for someone, especially someone who's maybe dealing with a mental health issue with their own stress?
Yeah, I think that we talk about holding space as in a container, and maybe a version. My type of coaching is like a version of psychological health and safety. It's one-on-one, but we're a third party outside of the work environment. It is this safe container where our desire is for the client to feel like they can explore any idea, and they can talk without feeling judged from the other side. And the time, the focus, without distraction from outside sources, is what we give them, and just open ears to anything that might come up. It's really an opportunity for the client to rest and rest in their truth and to explore their truth. Because when you're busy doing, it's difficult to change your trajectory. You have to stop. You have to rest. You have to become self-aware. And we're just the conduit for them to get there. And we're just the reminder of how they do it, because that innate memory might just be gone or muddled because of the busyness. So all it is removing the distraction and helping them focus, tune in, and rest in their own truth.
Mm-hmm. So how do you help the executive who you're coaching who says, come on, I've only got this, I've got a lot of things to do, like hurry up, what do I need to do? How are you going to fix me?
Well, it's a good question, and I think one that informs the bigger conversation of really how important is this to you, and how do we work within the confines of your timelines and your own expectations. True coaching isn't for the faint of heart. If you really do want to get to the core of it, it does take time. It takes commitment. As I said, you're building a muscle. You're not going to run that marathon overnight. So a quick fix me attitude, is not going to be super effective. I think we can still have a good conversation that could be a pebble in the pond. So I wouldn't even discount that mentality, because it is this person's truth. That being said, I would love to dig in a little bit more and find out a bit more as to how coaching would land in their true priority and if they're ready for it. Because it might just simply be they're not ready, and that's okay. So I would probably have an exploratory conversation to say, is this the right time? Because if not now, we could absolutely do it later. People's lives, as we said, they're not static, they're moving all over. So sometimes they're better than others. And if there's never a good time, maybe coaching just isn't the right modality for them.
Well, how often do you find that somebody comes to you because their boss says that they need a coach? In other words, it's almost like a performance management issue. We've had employees complaining about you, you need to get a coach. How do you deal with the lack of, because what you're saying is you can do it on your own time, but these folks can't. They're kind of mandated to do it and do it now.
Yeah, and I think in that particular case, yes, it happens. I think with larger organizations and who have experience with coaching, it comes a little bit more out of those organizations. And, there is absolutely a level of dignity and compassion I still absolutely feel for the coaching clients. And they do have time blocks to chat with us. And again, we can make that coaching what they want it to be. We do have to meet them with where they're at. So I'm not, a coaching course of time that I might give you would be very different than somebody who was mandated and feeling the pressure to perform different. So yeah, there can be pushback, absolutely. But again, exploring, being open to exploring what it means to that person, because maybe, they have their own personal hurt, and maybe there's parts of it, we bring psychological safety into that meeting, and what would make them feel safe and open. And, at the end of the day, it doesn't happen often, but it does happen. Sometimes it's just not a right fit. And sometimes there's a different coach that they might connect with better, or you as a coach just aren't connecting with that client either. So there are options. I would say coaching is very similar to finding a doctor you connect with or a psychologist. I would say, if you're not feeling it, it's okay to explore others. Not everybody works for the other person, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Let's explore and see what we can do to get you where you want to go.
Great. Yeah, that absolutely true. And Myla, can you give us some, of course, not giving away any confidential information, but can you give us some examples of success through coaching?
Yeah. There was an executive I coached who had never been coached and who had said that they kind of didn't think it was for them, but they were still curious. So we did go forward. And I would say that they had some traditional views about management styles, and admittedly knew that some others were afraid of them. And again, I just met this person where they were, and they were open to the concept, and did say that they did feel a bit of a struggle because it was sort of this new age way of doing things as well. And so it felt a little fluffy for them, but they stuck with it. They didn't need to, because it was of their own accord. They reached out to me, but they stuck with it, and we did have success because, again, I did not put my agenda on them. This person decided exactly what it was that was most important to them to work on. And we focused in tightly every time we met on their topic at hand. It wasn't with our type of coaching, with integral coaching, we really focus in on what is most important to that person at that time. It's not, we might start broad in our discussion, but we really narrow it in to one or two sentences of what they hope to do better at, or to have more of capacity of, so that we can always focus in on that and not get distracted. And so when you do focus in, meet the client where they're at, speak their language, we really can see some great results. And oftentimes it isn't necessarily in that very moment, although, aha moments happen all the time. It can be something that they carry with them days, weeks, months, or even years. As my story, it wasn't coaching per se with my boss, but over a decade later, it's so impactful, even just telling you that. Oftentimes there's something, the client will have their own light bulb moment from us drawing out what is already inside of them, that they will remember that, and it will be impactful in a really pivotal time in their life. So success can be in the moment, but it can also be far down the road that we're not even aware of.
And so with that particular executive who was intimidating, I guess, that people were afraid of that person, how did it impact them? Did you ever find out?
During our course of time, they did say that they had feedback that there was differences in their demeanor and behavior. Long term, I haven't contacted that person. I leave it to them to contact me. But in our short period of time, they said that I was able to draw out things in them that in their, I believe they were in their early 60s, had never even thought about before. And I don't know if that's testament to me. I would say it's more our coaching method, and just really the value we place on, again, meeting the person where they're at, and their own self-awareness and practice. So I've only really had fantastic feedback on our coaching method, because we really value human development, and we don't tell, we ask, and we support, and we're just a conduit. As I say, we hold that space for the person to get where they unconsciously know they want to go.
So your description of the coaching you do sounds a lot to me like an approach that a psychologically safe manager would take with their employees.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, it really is. And again, I think that's what attracted me all to it, to the coaching technique itself, but then also to the psychological health and safety training and learning about the standard, et cetera. It just all really fits. And because I have my own experience as, I would say more of a mid-level executive, and my own challenges with staff, I bring my own learned experiences of my own mental health, but also experiences managing other people and how my own mental health impacted them, and my lack of self-awareness and my own busyness and my own stories, that I feel like I can empathize quite a bit with the managers and leaders who are knowing, like, I got to do something different here. I just don't know what to do. And because I lived it, and I just have so much empathy for the tough work that our leaders do and how hard it is. Like, you don't see yourself in the moment. And when you do finally see yourself in the moment, that is success. And then we can begin to change, and drawing out that seeing yourself is again, that self-awareness is most important to lay that foundation for change and to build those muscles.
Yeah. I think about the number of things that I did as a leader, as a manager, that I would absolutely do differently now. And that, as you learn more, you don't do things quite as haphazard. And it's exactly what you just said, Myla, that when we are aware of ourselves in the moment, we don't have to look back and go, oops. We can catch ourselves right then and there and say, oh, I'm sorry, that came out wrong. Let me try again. Can you share some of the things that you did as a leader that you would do differently now?
Oh, where do I begin? One of I guess, like, tongue in cheek, where do I begin? But I think the number one thing that I learned is that, again, as long as you want to do better, and you are willing to be humble and admit your mistakes, you will garner change in yourself and others. One of the things that I don't know why it stuck with me, but it was in my downest time. I was not at my best. And one of the staff that I work with came to my office, and I was working on my computer, and they said something to me, and I just responded like this. I didn't turn right around. And I guess unconsciously in the moment, I knew that wasn't quite right, but I didn't change it. I knew it wasn't quite right because I remember it, but I didn't change it in the moment. But looking back, that must have felt so disrespectful to her, because it happened.
Just waved her off, because I'm just thinking people listening to the podcast wouldn't see what you did, but you just waved her off like, I'm busy right now, go away.
Exactly. And even though that really wasn't my true intent, that's how it came out. That's how it landed. That's how it was interpreted. And that's how it was lived for this other person. I am so regretful of that thing that we haven't talked about it to this day, but like I said, it obviously landed somewhere inside of me because I remember it. And it just feels like I was in such a dark place myself. I wasn't thinking straight. And I wasn't thinking what it would feel like to be that other person. And I think the hardest thing us as leaders grapple with is we're so ingrained in our own stories and our own busyness that we forget what it's like to be on the other side and to place ourselves into that other person's shoes, to feel empathy and just to live like them in that one moment. And that itself can change your perspective on so many things.
Mhm. Yeah. I remember a time when somebody told me they did something in a way that I hadn't asked them to do it. And I said, well, that's not the instruction that I gave you. And after I got that out of my mouth, I realized the way they did it was better, like much better than what I said. There was absolutely no reason why we shouldn't all do it their way, but it was my ego, my pride that came out first. And as you say, you live with that. And to this day, I think, well, why did you say that? Like, why did you get your back up about something that was somebody taking initiative, somebody making something better? But we do, right? And that idea of having enough trust that people would say, oh, you're just giving me the wave, or you're just a little shook up about this, that they can speak their truth in that moment is where we want to go. But we don't always get there.
Yeah, and I think the cool thing about what you said too about psychological health and safety, you know, I'm focusing a lot on leadership development, but it's not just about leadership development. It is that two-way conversation. And we do need, leaders need to be open to the truth of the way they show up, their own truth, but the truth of how the others experience them. You need to have a humbleness and a huge vulnerability to hear that. And that is so scary for so many people, whether you're, you know, a very traditional person with so-called old-time values, or somebody who's a little bit more open. It is scary no matter how you look at it, no matter how they respond to it. For somebody to tell you that you're not showing up the way that you want, or that you have hurt others. But that is the truth of solid leadership, is vulnerability and being open-minded and hearing all sides of the story, not just your side of the story. So those conversations for a psychological safe workplace absolutely are two ways. And sometimes a workplace might need a facilitator because it might feel a little too strained for a leader with a history or staff with a history to open up those conversations. So bringing in a third party can sometimes be the first step in moving people towards that.
Mm-hmm. I love the topic of vulnerability, thanks to Brene Brown. But I think about when I was younger, I couldn't be vulnerable because I was afraid. I was afraid that somebody would know I don't know everything. I was afraid that I would be judged. I was afraid that I'd be embarrassed. And as you get older and wiser and more confident, vulnerability is the strength that comes from being wiser and confident, because you understand that if somebody sees your weakness, you'll be able to recover from that we all have them, and that the idea that you could, or anybody could be perfect, is just illusion to begin with. But it took a lot of years to get to that place.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's one of those things too, that some days we're better at it than other days, right? When we're rested and our filters are all well and in place, we can be open to more things. But if we're tired and worn out, it's a little bit harder to be vulnerable, because we just aren't necessarily aligned to be able to feel the truth of that. And Lee said, it's scary as heck. And I think for me, I still struggle with it. And I was chatting to somebody about the fact that I'm doing this podcast and how I'm going to tell my story. And I said, man, I still, even though like I'm an advocate and so many people have heard this, I still feel a little scared, a little vulnerable to tell my story, what's happened, and like to talk about like, I actually know something here. You know, but at the end of the day, if I'm going to help one person, it will have been worth it. And if I can learn a little bit more about myself, I can rest more often in that vulnerability and know that it will be okay on the other side. During my time with coaching training as well, lots of vulnerabilities came up. We were, oh my goodness, it was all self-awareness development. And one of the cool things that I learned about emotions is they're like a bell curve. They begin, they have a peak, and then they subside. And when we are peaking in our emotions, it's quite hard to be vulnerable. We are defensive. We have our armor on, as you know, Brene Brown says. But we always need to remember that emotions, they do come in waves and they do subside. And we are able to put a different lens on them over time. But as I've been able to look more at myself, and this is some of the things that we do with our coaching, is help people learn that as they become more aware of their emotions and their peaks and their troughs and their valleys and their highs and their lows, you can become more resilient because you kind of know what's coming, and you start to learn about your patterns, and we can normalize emotions and just look at them as more curious rather than a bad thing. And if we can bring that into the workplace and know that about other people, so if we can experience it ourselves, we can be okay with other people's emotions and their peaks and their valleys. And we can sit with them, and together we can be vulnerable and explore what's needed most in that moment for the leader and for the staff. And, you know, in the cases where you're exploring how a person needs to modify their work schedule, for example, and they're really shattered, or they're really not articulating their needs, it's okay, because you will have come in armed with this knowledge and experience that you get to now walk with this person and help them explore so that they can have their needs met without judgment. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to do it well, but it does not take a lot of work just to do it and just to show up. And that is really the most important thing. Being soft with yourself if you make a mistake, and being soft with your staff if they make a mistake. It's really about the give and take, and knowing that we're all human and that we're just in it together and we all want to do better together.
So I want to ask you a question. When you shared, you know, that before this podcast, you're saying, were you more worried about sharing your personal story of struggle, or more worried about sharing your expertise?
Well, I think in the beginning, I'll say it's both. Sharing my story to people who may have this idea of what I am, or what I was, or what I will be, and possibly to show them that I'm as fragile as any other human, just because I, you know, often show up with a hard exterior. That does feel hard, because any perceptions that they might have held in high regard might shift. And it's funny as the words are coming out of my mouth, because it's counterintuitive to everything I'm trying to do by being a mental health advocate, because I know that logically, I know that for any, you know, couple people that think lesser of me, there's going to be so many more that will feel relieved that there's parts of me that are not as strong as they would have thought. With respect to my knowledge base, huge, yeah, like the imposter syndrome is alive and well. And that's a vulnerable statement, because as I continue to work on myself, and, you know, what do I know when I'm still trying to work on myself, a mentality can peek in. So, you know, for me, that is a belief system that I need to work on and that I do struggle with. But I also know it's, I've come a long way, and I do have knowledge, and I do have that desire to help, and I do have a skill set. So I have to work on that, like anybody else. And
Right.
it's not, for me, it's not natural. And as much as we want to believe that so many people just show up with natural capacities and capabilities, that is not the case. We put in our time, and we're not perfect. It's both.
It is interesting. The imposter syndrome for me is fascinating, because I realize that we can only have the imposter syndrome when we have unreasonable expectations for ourselves, when we realize, like you said, none of us know it all, you know, and none of us know it all. Even what we do know, we don't know every day. Things change and evolve. But the beauty of coaching is you are not trying to be the expert on somebody else. You're trying to help them uncover their own expertise about themselves. So you don't even need to show up as knowing everything. You need that skill set to help people. And that's why I say, you know, a great boss is somebody who helps every single employee be their best selves, be successful, not the one who can do it all. Or, you know, they're the ones that raise them up to do it. So thanks for that, Myla. I have one more question for you. And that is, if you're talking to somebody who has no idea what psychological health and safety in the workplace is, and you're not allowed to use Martin Shane's definition that I'm sure you know, how would you describe to the layperson what psychological health and safety in the workplace is?
I've actually done this multiple times, so I'm sure the version of it changes slightly, but I always start with, like, you know how like every organization has an OH&S policy? So occupational health and safety, which is more focused on physical safety. This is like that, except for your mental health. So just really simple. Is it safe? Is it a safe work environment for your personal mental health needs? And we work towards everybody's version of that, so that not only is it a physically safe environment, it is a mentally safe environment.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Any last words of wisdom that you want to share with our listeners?
I'll be repeating myself, but I really want to invoke the idea that your desire to improve the psychological health and safety of your work environment is the most important thing. How you do it will change over time. Your capacity to do certain things will be different. But just like when we talk about coaching, meet your staff, meet your organization where they're at, not where you think they should be at, but where they're at, and start from there. And over time, you will see change in the uptake and the perception of what psychological health and safety is in your organization. And there's lots of supports out there. There's lots of free online supports. And then there's also consultants and coaches if you need a hand, but you can make it as small or as big as you want. But my advice is start small, because when we try something too big, it feels overwhelming. So small steps and build your psychological health and safety muscle in your workplace.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Myla. If people want to find you, where do they find you?
The best place to find me is on LinkedIn. And with the podcast here, I could also, if there's a website, I can provide my personal email. It's myladoncoachingconsulting.com. But I could also write that out for you.
No, that's great. We'll put it on there. So this will end up, some minor clips, some small clips from here will end up on LinkedIn. So thank you very much. And thanks for all that you shared today, Myla.